Welcome to the Practical Church Revitalization Podcast with our co-hosts Don McKinnon and Eric Malloy, where we look at church revitalization in real time.
So welcome to episode 3 of the Practical Church Revitalization Podcast. And this episode is going to be something that really is what we all need to have, no matter what. If you're in a revitalization or not, it is the books and resources that are available to us. I mentioned last episode, I mentioned one of our favorite resources is Revitalize and Replant with Dr. Tom Rayner and Mark Clifton and also Jonathan Howe. I got to throw him a thing there because the three of them really, that podcast since it began about 6 months ago or so, that has been something that's really been encouraging, a real uplift to listen to, because there's some good meat there. If you're somebody who's in a revitalization and you're looking for podcasts, that's something you just gotta bite into and chew on, because there's good information there. But in this episode, we are going to talk about, 10 books and resources. So I'm going to give 5, Eric's going to give 5, we're going to go back and forth. We're not in a boxing match when I say back and forth. That's not it.
I mean, it's important to read. I mean, there's, I tell my staff all the time that leaders are readers. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're not reading, like, what are you doing? You have to learn from someone else. Like, if you're not a lifelong learner, then ministry is not really a place for you. And man, hey, maybe that's harsh, and maybe you're hearing that, but I got to be honest with you. John Wesley famously said, "Reader, get out of the ministry." Eric Geiger wrote a blog on that a couple years ago, and you have to, because how else do you learn? Yeah, how else do you learn? I mean,
And that's the thing. If you can't, like, there are so many pastors out there, like myself, where I'm not even. I have my bachelor's from a Bible college in Christian ministry, but I'm not actively in seminary right now, and so, reading to me is one way that I have to keep learning. I have to keep that thing that lifestyle going, because there's going to be things that you're going to forget, but there's also things that you're going to read, which you're going to be like, oh, that's something I never even thought of.
Well, it's kind of a humility thing, I think, as well. I mean, if you're not humble enough to learn from other people, like, how can you lead, I guess, is my thing. So I tend to be a lot more of the direct style. So I got to be honest with you, if that hurts your feelings, like, I kind of don't care, because I got to be honest, I don't. If the John Wesley's "Reader, get out of the ministry," if that hurts your feelings, then I think you got to check yourself.
I can't believe it. A reformed guy just quoted a Wesley.
I know, it's crazy, right?
Wow.
But it's true. I mean, he did it well. That's I don't love a lot of Wesley stuff, but that's. You can't.
Well, I can't knock Wesley, because I went to Eastern Nazarene, and so I was kind of, I won't say baptized in that, but there are good things. Charles Wesley, let's face it, Charles Wesley, king of hymns, right there.
Right.
He wrote some of the greatest hymns that we sing today. And it doesn't matter what denomination or what your theological background is. He wrote songs that even now worship teams are sitting there and trying to do a new spin to, or a new verse to, or however they do it these days, but they're adding stuff to those songs and just really bringing it home. So speaking of bringing it home, we're gonna break into our top 10 list of resources and books and resources, whatever you want to call it. Eric, I'm gonna throw it to you.
Well, I didn't put mine in any particular order, but I'm gonna lead off with one that's by Ed Stetzer. It's called "Planting Missional Churches," which you're probably like, well, this is a replant podcast. Why are you? But what he does really right there is he talks about being able to plant a church that's missional, that sees the mission of God as important, as seeing not being so inwardly focused on yourself, but on following God's mission and being able to plant and structure a church that does so. And while, yes, we're not planting a church, we do need to have a similar kind of idea as a church planter would, with the idea of being missional, and reaching out and sharing the gospel and seeing people come to Christ. I mean, that's something I think that established church pastors could really learn from church planters, is the idea of being missional, of being visionary, of being kind of that focused kind of guy. So for me, that was a book that meant a lot. I do have some honorable mentions, but I didn't write them down, so we're not going to even going to go there.
Yeah, I have that book too. That was one of the first books I actually picked up as I was leaving college, and really challenged by a lot of what I learned in college, really kind of directed me to be in the church plant that we ended up joining at that time. So it's a really good book out there. All right, so mine are not in any particular order right now. One that I have listed down is Can These Bones Live? And this book I bought in the last year since I started this journey. It's by Bill Hennard, and it shows the vision and direction are tools needed for church revitalization. It's one thing to be called to revitalize a church, but if you don't have the vision to do it and you don't have the direction to do it, it's not going to work. It lists like a lot of things that churches need to do in order to become a living, breathing body of Christ, and it's really a good book. It's a thick book, so you're not gonna knock this book out in a day or two unless you have nothing better to do or you're laid up in the hospital somewhere. But this book is something that you're going to crack open, and it's going to get you thinking about where you're at. I would say this is a book that, if you're a pastor, if you're even a seminarian or in college, and you're wondering, is God calling me to revitalize a church? This is a book to get, even if you're going into that established church. There's another podcast out there, Established Church Podcast, with Sam Rayner, Micah Fries, and Josh King. That's good. Those are three guys that they're at different stages, and they've even revitalized their churches. And they'll tell you that you need that vision. You need the direction. It's getting a team together. You and me were teamed up by Terry Dorsett, and so there are times where I'll be texting you during the week, and feeling like crap because something didn't go right, and you're sitting there lifting me up, praying for me and everything, and that's what we need to do, with having the direction and vision, and really having people right there to bring in and be like a team member that's not necessarily part of the church, but is that outside source.
Well, I have something similar. I have an outside accountability board. It's three guys. It's how our church is recently constituted, and they hold me accountable because we don't have an eldership. We don't have a team of elders yet, just because we're just not there. Like that's the dream, of course. And I have to submit goals to them for the year. I have to, be accountable to them, all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of my team. If I'm struggling with some stuff, I'm like, hey guys, this is kind of where I'm at. Thankfully, I get to pick those guys, and one of them's a guy who mentored me as a teenager. I've known for more years than I'll care to fess up to. Another guy I've known since I was a teenager as well. He was my college. He's a pastor, and I talked about him the other day. He was in one of the other episodes. He's a pastor in Michigan, a replant pastor. A church merger pastor. The other one's a church planter locally. And so I have those guys as well who yes, while they are guys I pick, they're definitely guys, if I did something dumb, who would be like, dude, what's wrong with you? Like, why? You're a moron. Like, why would you do that? So I think it's important to have a team, whether it's, internally or externally, where we're both at.
Yep.
kind of where we're at right now. So, I think you're right. I think that's a good one. So my next book is very simple. It's Church Planting is for Wimps by Mike McKinley.
That is a good book.
So what's funny is I actually read that in like 2 sittings when I was a church planter. Go figure. Just because it looked interesting, so I picked it up. I read it real quickly. A friend of mine took a pastorate of of what we would call a replant church, and I gifted it to him because I was like, "Hey, dude, here you go. It's a good book," and never thought about it again. And then actually I gifted it to another friend of mine as well, actually my friend in Michigan, and then ended up the pastor of First Church. I was like, maybe I should order that book again and thumb through it, since that's kind of what we're doing. And, you and I we're going through a cohort,
Yep.
with Overseed, where we're kind of reading through that book, and so it's man, if you're a replant or revitalization guy, number one, it's an easy read.
Yep.
It goes fast.
Yep.
The guy's entertaining. He pokes fun at himself as well, which I'm a big fan of. I poke fun at myself too. But it's really practical, and you kind of get to, you hear the guy. I feel like you really kind of hear the guy's heart kind of come out and what happens. And so it's nice to be able to, to hear someone else who's been there.
And it's probably the one book that the name will throw off. Like, if you're a church planter and you're buying that book because it says church planting is for wimps, you're not understanding what
Right.
Like, it was on my list to buy when I was thinking about being a church planter.
Which is why I bought it.
Right. And
Right.
and it's not about church planting.
No.
It's about revitalization.
Right. Which is hilarious, as I look at the journey, how I got to revitalization, and I look back and I'm like, okay, God, you've had me on this path for years, and I just had no idea, and you had to do some work in my life, and who I was, to get me here. So I just think it's funny. So it's a good one. It's good. It's really, it's an easy read, which I think is nice. Especially if you're busy and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's solid. It's got some good. It's really
Yeah. It's got some good
Yeah.
points and some good life experience.
Yeah. I think that's sometimes what we need, because church planting's been the cool, sexy thing lately. And so it's nice to read someone who's doing something.
Yeah.
You know.
And I mean, like, we're here at this point where revitalization is kind of like ground zero. And even though there are people that will say, that there's been revitalizations for 10, 20, 30 years, but it's really in the last half decade that it's starting to pick up steam, and people are starting to take notice. We have networks now that are really starting to realize, the Gospel Coalition has started small town summits, they call them. Acts 29 is rumored right now to be thinking of starting their own network for revitalization aside from church planting. North American Missions Board has their own Revitalize, Replant initiative. So this is something that's really starting to get going. Nine Marks, which actually that is the subheading of, I don't know what to call it, the imprint of church planting is for wimps. Mark Deaver has been leading that charge for quite some time.
Right. So it's finally something that's coming kind of into the forefront.
All right. Well, my next book is actually. I didn't really get into this when we did our intros, but when I went on my sabbatical, when I felt that restlessness as God was getting ready to call me into ministering and pastoring a church myself, the one book that we read, my wife and I, during that sabbatical was All In by Mark Batterson. And, one thing I appreciate about Mark Batterson is he writes simple but meaty. He will write something and you sit there and you're like, this is so simple, and yet you get something out of it. And All In was really a challenge for us because he wrote this book and he was saying, are you really all in with God? If God is calling you to something, are you all in to be willing to do everything that he's calling you to? And so the book, one thing with Batterson's books is he always focuses on a story. He doesn't just work on scripture, but he'll focus on a story that really inspires him, and then he takes that and brings it through the book. And so one thing with this book was he was writing about missionaries. I forget the name of the area, but it was one of those Pacific island nations, and the missionaries were going there, but they were selling everything they had except for what they were going to take, and what they were going to take was going to go into a coffin. They bought a coffin. They would take all their belongings, put it in the coffin, put it on the boat, and go to that island, because they knew that God was calling them to leave everything that they were, wherever they were, whether it was England or America, and come to this island nation, die there. They might be martyred, or they might live and leave a gospel legacy. But that was how all in they were, is that they were willing to follow God unto death. It was really an interesting thing. In fact, if I remember the book right, like in some of these missionaries' cases, they actually went, there were groups that would go there and burn the boats. Wow. Because they just wanted to show the people that they were committed to them. And so there's a lot of stuff, and it really, for me and my wife, it really affected us in such a way. Was, are we willing, were we holding on to everything in our church in Middleborough? Were we holding on to small things, thinking that this church couldn't flourish without us? Or were we willing to let go of everything we held dear, titles or whatever you want to call it, and just go where God was directing us? And I look back now a year later, and it's a move. I am happy that I read this book and that it took us in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's something which should be a podcast for another day. But I think it's something as believers we all struggle with, the idea of giving everything up and being all in. But we'll let that one set.
Yeah,
because we could talk about that for a while. It's funny you talked about 9 marks. My next one's 9 Marks of a Healthy Church, and the series that kind of goes with that. It's by Mark Dever, and he talks about the 9 marks of it. He did this big study and this big work, and he came up with 9 marks that make churches healthy, that healthy churches have. And it's stuff: sound doctrine, expositional preaching, church discipline, church membership. I'm blanking on some of the sound. I'm blanking on some of the other ones, but anyway,
evangelism.
So it's evangelism. So it's 9 marks, 9 things that healthy churches do, and it's really kind of easy. It's not easy to do, but it's an easy to understand. It's an easy concept. And then they have smaller books that kind of go into more depth.
I actually have one on my list. So.
Yeah. They kind of go into more depth about that. So I really like it because it does kind of give you a litmus test for some ideas of a healthy church. Which, let's be honest, most of the time we call a healthy church a church that's growing and has bigger numbers every week. And that's, as someone who's pastored a church that grew like that doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy.
Right.
It just means that it's big, or that people share dysfunction and they all, bring it to the table and never deal with it. So that's it's something we got to understand. But it's good. Not a quick read, and not super big, but kind of hard. It would be tough to sit and read quickly. Like, it's almost one of those, like, you have to read a chapter and kind of let it sink in and resonate. Like, I wouldn't read more than a chapter a day, and I'm a big reader. Like, I go pretty quick. But it was like one of those, I had to kind of let it kind of hang. Yeah. So
there was another book. I don't know if I want to call it a honorable mention. I think it was called Kingdom Matrix.
Yep, I have that.
And he talks about how it's one of the first few chapters. He talks about the pastor that was out jogging and has the heart attack.
Yeah.
And he's leading the big 8,000, 9,000 member church. Has the heart attack, and it takes like 6 months for him to come back to the pulpit. And when he comes back, he's only got 2,000 people left. But he realizes that the church was built around him and not God.
Right.
And that's where a lot of churches sadly have been built up around. And it's like we hear these guys. They sound good. They really sound good. And I don't doubt that. They love the Lord. I believe that they do love the Lord, but it's really like we live in a day and age where it's the pastor as CEO, and it's not a healthy thing for churches to really be, what's the best Chick-fil-A principle we can take into the church. If it was that, Jesus would have been probably bringing in a lot of the Pharisees to, tell me, what's the best thing we can do, because they were selling stuff in the temple.
Who was it? It might have been Clifton. Someone made a tweet about what can the church learn from the Toys R Us collapse. He's like, please don't write that. We can't learn anything from there. They're a business.
He made a meme.
We're the church.
He made a meme. I remember.
It was great.
That.
I was like, thank you, because I hate when I read that. Like, the guys were like, what can the church learn from the collapse of?
Yeah.
We can learn that things are temporary and that we shouldn't build the church on worldly business principles. I don't know.
Yeah. All right, so off of you, talking about 9 marks of a healthy church, I put evangelism down as my next book, which is by J. Mack Stiles. And again, it's these thin little books. It's one thing that every dying church needs to be doing, needs to learn to do in order to have this culture. It talks about developing a culture that is clear and understandable within the church of what it means to be a church that is going out and sharing the gospel and talking to people. A lot of people think they need to have the seminary degree or the Bible degree in order to really talk about God. And our own network, NAM, they have like a very simple one, which I like, is the 3 circles, where it's like God and the gospel and you, and it's like, how does this all fit together? And it was like, we were explaining that with our own people. They got it, and so it's beginning these conversations going on with people. Evangelism is one of those key areas.
Kind of going along, maybe a little bit of a detour, is, and I can't pronounce this guy's last name to save my life, Nathan Pinko, sorry, buddy. But it's called Reviving New England.
I just got that.
I finished it. Once again, a quick read. Now, mind you, when I say quick read, I read really fast, and I read a lot. Sarah makes fun of my nightstand, because I have like 5 books on it, and I kind of thumb through them every night. Like, I go to bed and I read my Bible, and then I read a chapter of a couple different books at a time. So when I say quick read, but it was good. He did a good job. Now let me challenge some of you. If you're listening to this from a place that's not New England, there's still some stuff you can learn from that. What he does a good job of is understanding his context and sharing his context, which is important. The gospel's the gospel, the Bible's the Bible, but your context is different. I think about Paul at Mars Hill, when he spoke to them differently than he would have spoken to the Pharisees, because he reasoned with them, he talked to them in a different way. He also says, I became all things to all people that I might win some. And so we have to understand is that, reviving New England is different than reviving, Georgia or Washington State or Iowa, and so I think it's good, especially if you're a local guy. That's definitely something to check out. If you're not, at least it's good to kind of, help you think about what your community looks like.
Yeah, that's definitely. I just got that book a couple of weeks ago, because I'm like you. I go through books. Like my wife is so glad I have a church office now, because like the one thing was, if you went into our bedroom, there was like a whole section of books.
Yeah, that was our living room.
Yeah.
And Sarah was like, "Oh my gosh, you have an office? Get them out of here." Mm-hmm. So it's
Yes. Now, actually, this is kind of the ironic thing. The next book on my list is Biblical Church Revitalization by Brian Croft, and it actually happens to be the book that my wife is now reading. And she's getting a lot out of this. This is a quick read, and I think I read this book in 3 days, and I'm a busy person. I'm working a 40-hour a week job. And I got through this book in 3 weeks. It is a book that actually Southern Seminary requires in their MDiv program. If you read this book, it actually has the notes and the syllabus for it. So this is like a raw book. This is a book that And it's really good. He goes into what the pastor must be ready to do to bring the church back from the brink of death. And he talks about many of the trends used today are just Band-Aids. And that's what it is. It's just, the pastors come in, they're revitalizing, they look to the planting movement and they say, oh, what can we grab? But what they don't understand is that church planting and revitalization are two separate things. What's going to work in one isn't going to work in another, because in one, you're creating something brand new. In revitalization, you have something that's established, so you have something that's very set in its ways, and you're going to have time to turn that around. And so that's one thing that he gets into with that. And it was really a good book, and it's something that I think any person in revitalization needs to add that to their bookshelf.
So I'm going to go off script here. I wrote one down, and it's good, but I was sitting here thinking, I was like, I don't know why I wrote this one down instead of a different one. My last one's going to be Rainer, and he wrote a book called Simple Church. Mm-hmm. And I would listen, if you're a planter, if you're a pastor, if you're a revitalizer, whatever your role in ministry is, you need to read Simple Church. I bought that book for every person on my staff and made it required reading. That's basically what he's saying, is that we get so program driven in the church that we clutter our calendar and we clutter our schedule, and we can't really do anything well because we're doing too much. And so he's saying, what he talks about is making the church simple. Focus on your mission. Do what supports your mission, and don't do what doesn't support your mission. Right. So, and of course, I'm simplifying it, which is fun that I'm simplifying a book called Simple Church. But that's really kind of what he does, is he says, hey, this is like, pare down your church, make it, and especially in a revitalization or a replant where you're low on staff, you're low on people, you're low on members, you're low on finances. You do have to be a little more focused and a little more simple.
Yep.
And do what you do well. Don't do 100 things okay. Do a few things really, really well.
Yep.
And focus on that. So that to me, that's important.
And when you're talking about like having explosive growth, that's one of the things that you got to think about, is if you're having explosive growth and you're trying to do so much and you don't even have the leadership yet in place, a lot of this explosive growth isn't going to stick.
Right.
That those people are going to be there. They're going to look around and they're going to say, this church is trying to be the next Mars Hill or the next Village Church or whatever, and they're just going to leave and go elsewhere where they feel that this group has it together.
Right.
So that's one thing that I've been thinking about as we go forward, is how can I take what little leadership I have at First Baptist and take that and bring it to another level, but also get it into a level where they're able to train. I've got my worship leader. He's actively working with somebody from the church who is not there yet. They're not even coming. In the last podcast when we were talking discipleship, and you gave your 6 C's or 5 C's, I can't remember what it was, but
4 C's.
4 C's. I have my own. It's not an acronym. It's FAT. Faithful, accountable, teachable. And what it is faithful means that you're there every day. Every time the door's open and there's something going on that you should be a part of, you're there. Accountable, you're willing to listen to what we're saying and do what we tell you to. And teachable means that, as we're training you up, you're able to take that and then not only take what you're learning, but then reproduce that to other people. So, that person that my worship leader's with isn't there yet. My worship leader is, and he's somebody that, he comes to me, and talk about the accountability. He'll come to me, in the office, and he'll be like, let me tell you, this is what's going on with this person. This has me worried. We need to be praying. We need to, figure this out. And that's the thing, you're you're trying to do all this simple stuff before you can, you have to stay simple.
Right.
Because the explosive growth that some of these churches experience isn't healthy. And, keep it simple. All right. So talk about off of yours. My last book is Reclaiming Glory by Mark Clifton. So we're representing Revitalize and Replant Well on this podcast.
That's on the bottom of my stack of my nightstand, which doesn't mean it's on the bottom of my stack. It's in queue.
Yeah.
It's in queue. Think Netflix. It's in queue.
Yeah. Now this book I just got. I actually had a question about a month ago taken on the podcast where they did that, and they sent me the book for using my question. And I'm just beginning this book, but it is something that is really good. Like it's one that I think because of the movement, and I think Clifton is definitely one of the forebearers up there with Mark Deaver on this movement. It's good. And what he's doing is he's showing that a dying church that closes its doors doesn't bring God's glory.
Right.
Like if a church closes its doors, what is that saying about the God we serve?
Right.
And this is why, if you go back to our first podcast where we were talking about the different types of revitalization, one of the things that he is a proponent for is if you know that the time is coming near, just give your building to a church that needs it. Give it to a church that could really use it. That way the doors don't close, and what happens is people look and they say, these people are serving a God that can really, bring this church back to life. So it's something where he's talking about that, and he reminds churches today that, if you're trying, talk about simple church, if you're trying to be bigger than the plan that God has, you got to remember that you're serving a community. You're serving, and sometimes you're serving in places that are small. So you might think and want to be the next big pastor, the next big celebrity pastor, but if God's called you to this small little community, or even a neighborhood in a big city, just be what you need to be to those people that are coming in your door.
We say it at our church, don't minister to the empty seats. Minister to the people who are in front of you. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes as pastors we get caught up on who's not here, and we have all these chairs that nobody's in. How do we get people in the chairs? And we miss the people who God has right in front of us that we need to be investing in. So
it's kind of like the sin of partiality.
Yeah.
James talks about that in his letter to the church, and he's talking about if you're spending all your time on the rich person, but the poor person, you're basically using as a footstool. What are you showing there?
Right.
So anyway, with that, we are going to close out this episode of the Practical Church Revitalization podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our iTunes. And
or whatever podcatcher you're on.
Yeah, I've got to learn podcatcher, so we might not quite be there yet.
Okay, so whenever we get there,
yeah,
and go like us on Facebook, share with your friends.
Yes, All right, and that probably should have been on the cutting room floor, but anyway, we're gonna say bye. God bless. The Practical Church Revitalization podcast is sponsored by Overseed. Overseed's vision is to see growing historic churches in every New England town reaching their communities for Christ. If you want to be part of a mentorship program and you live in the New England area, please go to overseed.org and find out how you can get in contact with one of the hub churches in the area or one of the many pastoral network cohorts that are run in the area. Once again, go to overseed.org for more information on the Overseed Network.